Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and strength coach, and I specialize in vestibular disorders. Welcome to my channel, The Steady Coach. Today we're going to be talking about the topics of stress, anxiety, and chronic dizziness. These are topics I talk about a lot on my channel, but I get a lot of really great questions about stress, anxiety, and chronic dizziness, and I wanted to dedicate a video very specifically to these topics and give you some ideas of how you can help manage stress, anxiety, and dizziness, and how they may be feeding into each other in ways that you're not aware of right now. In this video, I'm going to be answering some commonly asked questions here. Those questions include, is my anxiety causing my dizziness? Or conversely, I'm not anxious at all, so how can you say that anxiety and dizziness are related? Another question I get asked, do I need to eliminate stress in order to get better from my chronic dizziness? Or on the flip side, I'm really not stressed out and I'm a pretty laid back person, so how can you say that stress is causing my chronic dizziness? And finally, the most stressful part of my life right now is dizziness, so how can you say that stress caused my dizziness in the first place? These are all great questions. So to answer them, I want to be a little clearer on what I mean by the word stress in the first place, and also touch on what anxiety is in the context of stress. So stress is kind of a buzzword right now. We hear about it all the time in the media, and you've probably already parsed from what you've read, what you've heard, that stress is divided up into two main categories. The categories being acute stress, so stress that's short-lived and goes away, and chronic stress, which is stress that kind of hangs out and keeps things going. But really, stress doesn't necessarily mean something that stresses you out per se. Stress just refers to something that your brain and body need to adapt to. So an acute stressor, so in other words, a type of stress that comes and goes, could be something like tripping over a brick and needing to catch your balance. It could also be something like getting married and having a really difficult time getting your wedding ready. Stress can also be getting a text or getting an email. Stress can be getting hungry and needing to go to the fridge to get something to eat. Stress can be feeling cold, so you put on a sweater. So in other words, stress is anything throughout your day or throughout your life that you need to adapt to and that you need to take action for. So when it comes to acute stress, what happens is that your body senses that something needs to happen. And that can be based on a physical sensation, like I'm cold, I'm gonna put on a scarf or a sweater, or it can be based on a thought. Oh man, I forgot to write this email today, I'd better go write that right now. It can also be in response to a feeling. I'm feeling kind of miserable right now, so I'm gonna eat some chocolate. And what drives you to action in all of these cases is the activity of your sympathetic nervous system. Now, I know we've talked about the sympathetic nervous system before in the context of fight or flight mode, which is when you're driven to fight something that's attacking you or run away from it. But your sympathetic nervous system is actually active on and off all the time, because anytime you need to do something, your body needs to get itself into a state of action-orientedness. In other words, it needs to get ready for action. So when you have that thought, uh-oh, I forgot to write that email, your body and brain, your nervous system, in other words, prepares you for standing up. So your heart rate might increase, your respiration or your breathing might increase. You might stop noticing other things in your peripheral vision. You might just notice things in front of you because you are driven to do that particular thing. Again, this is a completely normal response. What happens with chronic stress, and again, this is the more prevalent view. We're going to get into the nuances here in a few minutes. What happens with chronic stress is that that cycle just never really turns off. So in the example that I gave just a moment ago, where you have to write the email, you would write the email and your body would then say, okay, cool, we've done our thing. Now let's go rest and veg. And in that case, the sympathetic nervous system would turn off. That fight or flight or action-oriented nervous system would turn off. And the parasympathetic nervous system, in other words, that rest, relax side of your nervous system, would activate and allow you to rest. In chronic stress, that doesn't really happen. You stay in this active, I'm going to do something right now state all the time. And I'm sure you've heard lots of theories about why that happens. Modern life is very stressful. We're always connected to our devices. And as I mentioned earlier, even getting a text message, even a good text message, is a form of stress. It is a form of needing to respond, needing to be active. So these things can all combine into creating this state of nervous system activation in which our brains are just kind of generally in this sympathetic or fight or flight type of mode. And this is just talking about those external stressors, so these obvious types of stress that I just talked about. This doesn't even touch on the type of chronic stress it can lead to when, in order to exist in polite society, we can't always express how we feel. So, for example, chronic stress might not take the form of an incessant tidal wave of emails and text messages. It can also take the form of a less than great relationship that's ongoing, in which, for example, you can't express how you really feel because it could ruin the relationship. Or in an even more subtle way, you might not feel empowered to even recognize your own feelings about the relationship because you feel that it's not okay to feel those feelings. Now, let me give an example of what I mean by that. Let's say that one of your parents gets sick. Most of the people who watch my videos are adults, so an adult parent gets sick, and you have to care for that parent. Well, that would bring a whole bunch of acute stress onto you and chronic stress onto you. You'd have to take your parent to doctor's appointments, you'd have to worry about your parent's health, you'd have to worry about medical treatment, obvious sources of external stress, both acute and chronic. But what about your own feelings about your parent getting sick? Beyond the obvious loving feelings, you might secretly actually also resent your parent for getting sick and taking you away from the other things you want to do. You might have an irrational anger or rage at that parent for getting sick. These are just feelings. They're normal human feelings to have about difficult or complicated situations in our lives. And these types of emotions, especially when they conflict with your values, can also often be a form of chronic stress that keeps your nervous system in that hyper alert or hyper vigilant state. And what I've found is that people respond to that kind of stress across a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, we have that classic anxious response. So many of you who've watched my videos have heard me talk about the type A perfectionistic personality type that tends to end up with chronic dizziness. And many of you have identified as a more anxious personality. You're perfectionistic and you tend to get anxious about not being perfect. So these are the people who tend to really get caught up in that external stress, in those acute and chronic stressors that are on the outside. So in the example of the parent who got sick, they'd be caught up in that never-ending cycle of medications, worrying about who's caring for the parent, what's going to happen to the parent, and worrying about the future constantly. This, again, places a huge burden on your central nervous system and is going to keep you in that sympathetic nervous system state. Then way over on the other end of the spectrum, we have the really calm people, the people who are never anxious, who are self-described laid-back people. What I find is that the people who end up with chronic dizziness, although they self-describe as laid-back or living low-stress lives, also tend to describe themselves as people pleasers or perfectionists or wanting to do the right thing, putting a lot of pressure on themselves. They just take a very laid-back approach to it and don't spend time feeling anxious about it. So in other words, they do put stress on themselves, but they're a lot less aware of how much stress they put on themselves. And for these people, there also seems to be a tendency in difficult situations to want to really push down those emotional causes of chronic stress. So in other words, it's kind of their general mode in a stressful situation to be the rock of the family, to be the laid back one, to be the one who can just handle things and be really calm. And that is a wonderful thing. That's not something that any of us want someone to change. But these people on that end of the spectrum also end up under a tremendous amount of self-generated pressure and can have a really hard time, in my experience, expressing their emotions about difficult situations. And a lot of us exist kind of in between those two extremes. And what I've also found is that some of us exist in different places along the spectrum depending on the subject matter. So some people will be really laid back, for example, about health problems, whereas others might be more laid back about what they're eating or their exercise routine. So how do you know if stress is playing a role in your chronic dizziness? Well, this type of stress that I'm talking about is much more subtle than the type of stress that leads you into this very obvious anxious state. Now, some of you are anxious, and if you're anxious and you find that taking a few deep breaths bring your symptoms down, then boom, we know that stress is affecting your dizziness. But for many of you, it's a lot more subtle than that, because you don't actually feel anxious or stressed out most of the time, or if you do, it really seems to be about your symptoms, and nothing else in your life really seems to be the cause. So I have a 3-step process for you that you can follow to determine which kind of stress and how much stress is playing a role in your symptoms. So step 1 is the part we've already done, which is knowing what stress is. Stress is just something that requires adaptation. It's just something that your body and brain need to respond to. There's nothing good or bad about it. It can be bad if it wears you down, or it can be good as a path to getting stronger and more resilient. For example, if you've ever been sore after a hard workout, your muscles get stronger after that, and then you don't get as sore the next time. So stress is the pathway to resilience if it's addressed correctly. So the key things to understand about stress is that it's not necessarily those acute, obvious stressors of your daily life that are affecting you, or the common chronic stress type things that we think of in modern life. Stress includes things like your own traits, or like your own inclination to, on one hand, perhaps get anxious and amplify stress and catastrophize and worry about it, and on the other hand, to potentially push stress down so you're not even aware of it. Those are both contributors to stress. And it's also important to understand that emotions that are difficult or painful to deal with are a huge contributor to the kind of stress that you're under on a daily basis. So it's important to look underneath the things that you normally think of as stressful to understand how your stress is affecting you. You want to look at things like your relationships, your family dynamics, and major events that happened around or before you got dizzy. Which leads us to step 2, understanding which stressors are the main contributors to your symptoms. Is it that you tend to be anxious and worry about things a lot of the time? Is it that you have very strong feelings about something that have just gone unacknowledged for a while? And going back to what I said a few seconds ago, what I found in my clinical experience is that it is never a coincidence what happened before your dizziness started. So think back to when your dizziness started, what was going on in your life at the time, and follow the breadcrumb trail. See if you can find some kind of pattern of emotional distress, pain, or stress that led you to that point. And step 3, the most important, is facing the stress. So remember how I said that stress is a pathway to resilience? If you're aware of stress and you turn and face the stress, then stress can make you stronger and more resilient than ever before. If we repress it or try to push it away, it just grows. So sometimes addressing your stress and facing your stress simply means acknowledging that it's there. Just understanding you have conflicting and painful emotions about something that happened before might be all you need to do. Sometimes that can involve just talking it over with a friend or a counselor, or sometimes it can even be done on your own through journaling. It's amazing to me how much just acknowledging how these stressors have played a role in the development of your dizziness makes a difference. In fact, when people ask me how likely it is that they're going to get better, I tell them that the prerequisite, in other words, the requirement for them to get better, is to understand how their stress, whether in the form of emotional distress, emotional pain, trait-related stress, or stressful life events, have played a role in their dizziness. When people don't believe that stress caused their dizziness, when they believe that there's something truly wrong with their bodies that can't be fixed, they don't get better. So my point here is this: having difficult feelings is just a part of being human. It doesn't mean that you now need to fly into a rage in order to no longer be stressed out. A lot of the time, the pressure just comes from trying to keep those feelings on the down low, or trying to control the feelings that are coming out in the case of someone who has anxiety. When we stop trying to control it and we just face it, we lean into it, in other words, we acknowledge that it's there, and we try to get to the bottom of what our emotional pain might be, that's when people get better. I know this is a topic we've talked about a lot on this channel, but I hope that clarified what I mean by stress causing dizziness. In many cases, stress is emotional pain in combination with other stressful life events and maybe personality traits that tend to make the pressure worse. Try out those steps and see how it helps you get to the root of your dizziness. I hope this was helpful, guys. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe. Comment below if you have any thoughts, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.